And in particular, where there's an economic benefit without upfront cost, they almost always choose the nature-based approach. But I think the challenge is that just the size and scale of traditional construction is a $10 trillion global market, right? For
Wow.
heavy infrastructure. And, the people are used to doing things the way that they're used to doing it, right? So there's some inertia in the status quo.
I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast. There's a lot of places where we live, where we work, where we play that are right at the intersection between land and water. Coastlines, rivers, seas, lakes, harbors, all of those things. And at that juncture point, at that meeting point, we're there because it's gorgeous, beautiful. It really supports life and activity, but there are also risks that we have to manage and actively manage. And we have a long history of doing that through building hard, impervious barriers between the sea, the lake, the river, and the land, the town, and where people are living. And those seawalls, for example, enable us to kind of live and work with the water, but they have some real disadvantages as well. They're incredibly costly. They degrade quickly with time, and they have a real impact on the natural environments, which are so valuable and so integral to our living and working with water and the sea in its different forms. It's remarkable that this is technology that's thousands of years old in some way, but also just in the recent years is going through a radical transformation.
So people, they're drawn to the coastline, they're drawn to creeks and rivers and lakes and streams, and they're drawn because of that beauty of what nature provides, right? And with living infrastructure, we can take those cues from nature and work to build in more nature compatible ways.
In this week's conversation, we explore the boundary between land and water and how to make these boundaries safer and more secure. Leonard Nelson is the CEO and co-founder of Natrx in North Carolina. His organization looks to nature for inspiration on how we can live with water in more innovative ways. Natrx incorporates nature-based solutions to integrate natural habitats and protective structures for waterfront assets. So, for example, instead of creating a seawall as a total barrier between land and water, it creates a permeable region so water can pass through it to still protect the water that's behind it. The issue is that this is becoming even more relevant today as the climate is changing, extreme weather events are getting more severe. As we've seen in some of the previous conversations, we're seeing increased levels of flooding, of either tidal flooding or nuisance flooding or severe storm flooding in all those different water formats. So that's putting increased demand on our ability to really make sure that the boundaries between land and water are safe and secure.
When you look at big picture at how we build, look at the infrastructure that supports society. So think of roads, bridges, power infrastructure. We're oftentimes using impermeable materials like asphalt, concrete, heavy aggregates, which are heavy rock type materials. Those tend to be impervious, right? And they tend to speed water up. So when you look at things like storm surge, hurricanes, floods, when water gets moving fast, it can be very dangerous, right? And that can cause harm both economically and can cause loss of life. So as we think about how to modernize our infrastructure, we can look to nature for cues. And if you look at things like coral reefs or oyster reefs or mussel beds or down trees in a creek or a stream, they tend to slow water down. So it allows water to flow, but it keeps it moving slowly. And I think when you see water that's clean and moving slowly, you can really create a lot of value, create a lot of beauty. Over 50% of the world's GDP is actually near a major body of water. So people, they're drawn to the coastline, they're drawn to creeks and rivers and lakes and streams. And they're drawn because of that beauty of what nature provides, right? And with living infrastructure, we can take those cues from nature and work to build in more nature compatible ways instead of just always using impervious bulk products like, say, steel reinforced concrete, rock, plastics, sheet pile, those types of impervious, more man made type materials.
So this is especially true in like coastlines along the eastern seaboard, for example. So rivers, creeks, anywhere connected to a mountain, hillsides. So it's not just the coast. We also think like if I'm moving from east to west, also the whole Appalachian mountain range, right? Because we have rivers here. And then we're
That's
starting to
right.
go into the plains. We have the whole Mississippi system. Then we're going
Mhm.
right into the Rockies. So the Rockies, and of course we have the coast on the west coast. Kind of across the country, we have these kind of infrastructure functions that
Right.
are really kind of, and they're getting exacerbated with more extreme weather, I imagine, that
Right.
how water interacts with our infrastructure is a really big issue. And
That's
if we
right.
want to make it safer, then learning from nature how we might do that and move away from just creating hard infrastructure.
That's right. If you just think about your water interactions in your daily life, if you've ever owned a house or rented an apartment, you're going to have drainage issues. You're going to have water challenges with how water flows and moves. And if you consistently speed it up, if you try to solve every problem by hardening, what tends to happen is you harden one spot and that speeds water up. And then you have to harden another spot and harden another spot. And that can become a downward spiral, right? Where water then starts moving really fast, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. And so if you think of the reverse, think of, say, a coral reef, right? That is knocking down wave breaks. It's doing multiple things at once, right? So it's providing a functional benefit for that shoreline and perhaps the properties behind it by knocking those waves down and slowing down the flow of water. But it's got a lot of nooks and crannies and complexity, and that provides habitat for a wide variety of species. That can be important economically, that can be important visually to bring beauty to the area. It can drive up property values. So if you destroy the coral reef and build a giant concrete seawall, you've just destroyed economic value, you've just destroyed the habitat, the whole reason that you moved to that coastline in the first place, right? And that same thing is true in a creek or a river or stream, a lake. We need to look for ways that we can harness the adaptive power of natural systems to protect not just our assets, but just overall the properties that we're entrusted with. And then secondly, to look at how can we do that in a way that adds value to our properties and communities.
So, like learning from nature, there's been great examples of that in a bunch of different fields. In your space, kind of where are we? Is this really early days? This is an insight. Now we need to learn to make it practical. Or you're actually already making this practical. How widespread is it? Or are we really
Mhm.
talking about early adopters here?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. Our team has been at it for about 20 years with modular nature-based shoreline protection solutions. And I guess we really came out of the living shoreline space. So, how do you protect a shoreline in a way that's more biodiverse, more attractive, and more resilient than, say, a plain, flat seawall? And that's been about 20 to 30 years that field has been developing. We've been leaders in that since the beginning, and we've deployed over 115,000 modular nature-based breakwaters, kind of coastal protection units. So we're a big part in trying to scale up this technique all across the country, in the future all across the world. And there are a lot of other practitioners and innovators out there that are doing work similar to
So
Natrix.
that's an enormous number, 115,000. So
Right.
what's the magnitude here? Is this a, because in some cases we're talking about a home, some cases we're talking about a town needs a breakwater. Like what does that look like?
So
115,000 different.
yeah, so these are modular reef-like units. So generally they're about 1 ton, either I'd say normally a half ton to a ton, so up to about 2,000 pounds. They are porous and they have a lot of roughness. They have a lot of habitat spaces. And again, the idea is that you let water flow, but you slow it down, right? So rather than having a flat wall and taking the impact of flow or a wave, we're trying to create something that can diffuse or mitigate that flow of water, but still allow for water exchange, right? So going back to that coral reef analogy, you're not completely stopping the wave, right? You want to let the water flow through rather than having a flat wall, but you want to have some flow, but you want to take some of the energy out of out of that flow or that wave.
Are there any great examples you can point us to, like where this has been kind of implemented in communities that are experiencing this?
I'd say some of my favorite projects are where we have, let's say, a private sector organization, let's say a energy firm or a port, and they're really excited about a nature-based project and they're working alongside a conservation organization, let's say Ducks Unlimited or the Nature Conservancy. And you get two groups that oftentimes you wouldn't think would, they may not get along, or you may think that they not may not share a lot in common. But when you look at the opportunity to use nature to solve problems operationally and to provide functional benefits to a private sector firm while you're providing benefits to biodiversity, fisheries, water quality, those are some of my favorite examples. Multiple states, North Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas. So we've done this all across the US.
So this is a place you have a port where you might need a seawall because you can't have that wave action. You need to protect ships, the machines, all the activity that's going on. But if you were just to go with kind of like an old fashioned version of a seawall, now you kind of separated that one body of water into two different bodies of water where, you have large interchange of maybe plant life and animal life and nutrient richness. But that might, now that harbor or that port that you just kind of walled off isn't getting the benefits of that. It's not getting the exchanges, et cetera. And so by moving instead to nature-based solution where you can actually, water actually is permeable, water goes through, you start to have more of those kind of nutrient exchanges, sea life, plant life kind of exchange going through that barrier. And so now you can get a harbor that's not as kind of lacking in all of the richness that's really important in our kind of waterways.
That's right. That's right. And economically, it can be impactful too. If you take a port, for example, a concrete seawall at somewhere like a port to build that would be something on the order of $1,000 to $2,000 a linear foot. We could provide a permeable, nature-based, say, oyster reef-like solution for, let's say, $300 to $600 linear foot, right? So a fraction of the cost because we're not mobilizing as much material. We're not bringing out concrete pumps and trucks. We're simply placing permeable modules on the shoreline that mimic the function of a natural oyster reef or a natural coral reef, right? And because there's some permeability, you don't have to do nearly as much engineering and heavy kind of soil management, tiebacks, and anchoring because the water can flow through, right? So you're taking pressure off of that protective device because there's some ability to flow. And it's really fascinating how these systems fail in big hurricanes. And we've seen quite a bit of that.
So on the economics, it's really surprising and kind of interesting to hear that I had long thought about the benefits of these kind of nature-based solutions, in part because in the traditional method, you put a large seawall in place. The moment you put that seawall in place, it's now a depreciating asset, right? Because it's getting pounded by
Right.
the sea. It's going to deteriorate. If you need it to be in place, as soon as you've spent the money to put it in place, you got to start budgeting to put its replacement in place, right? But a nature-based solution, as its nature is actually growing, it's going to get more robust with
Mhm.
time, right? So plants and animals live amongst that nature-based solution, and it becomes more robust and resilient over time. So I thought one of the great economic benefits of this thing is you're taking a depreciating asset and turning it into an appreciating asset, which is massive. But now you're also pointing out that even the initial investment is going to be cheaper on a per foot basis, 30 to 60% cheaper per linear foot.
That's right. That's right. And it's all dependent on location and context and design. But what we bring to the table are new tools and techniques, right? So everybody knows how to build a seawall, right? And the cost is the cost. And with today's labor and equipment prices and the cost of materials, it's not like the 1970s anymore when that stuff was super cheap. So those solutions are costly, and we have the ability to come in and look at the conditions, analyze the requirements, and say, "Hey, we've got a new tool, we've got a new technique, and in many cases, it's much more cost effective than traditional infrastructure construction." I'd say the main impediment really is just a mindset shift, right? Like people need to be open to trying new tools, to trying new techniques. We generally find that when clients seriously consider a nature-based technique, and in particular where there's an economic benefit with that upfront cost, they almost always choose the nature-based approach. But I think the challenge is that just the size and scale of traditional construction is a $10 trillion global market, right? For
Wow.
heavy infrastructure. And, the people are used to doing things the way that they're used to doing it, right? So there's some inertia in the status quo.
That's fascinating. What you're describing is an actually superior alternative, right? It's better on the short-term price, it's better on the long-term economics, and it has better environmental outcomes, right? So what's the timescale of these kind of infrastructure decisions? I mean, these are massive expenditures, there's a lot involved, and it must take a long time for people to wrap their head around making these kind of decisions.
It can. I think one of the advantages of kind of adaptive nature-based management, though, is it provides a different procedure and a mindset for asset protection and asset improvement. As you mentioned, with a man-made asset, it's more of a big bang approach, right? So I'm going to lay out a bunch of capital expense. I'm going to do some huge 3-year study, maybe pay some fines or some mitigation because I'm, say, harming the shoreline. That can take 5 years. And when you do that, it takes so long to go down that road with traditional construction, particularly on the waterfront, that there's a tendency to overbuild, right? So, well, I only have one shot at this. So I'm just going to make this thing as big as humanly possible. And so that drives your budgets up, your timelines up even higher. With nature-based techniques, you can manage it more adaptively. I'm just going to go place these things out here where I see that I'm maybe say losing some land or have some erosion or water's moving too fast. And oftentimes while you're doing that, you're providing an environmental benefit. So that streamlines permitting. There's not a lot of pushback because there's all these positive elements to what you're doing. If you need to, you can go out and put a few more in later, right? Or if you get hit by a massive hurricane, oftentimes they're just fine and the natural system grows back and it recovers and you don't have to fix it like you would a traditional hard asset, which would fail catastrophically. If you're going to put a giant seawall on a port, that's going to take 5 years plus, right? That's kind of how it goes.
That's fascinating. And are you seeing regulators, especially I guess environmental regulators, are you seeing them recognize the benefit and kind of is that flowing through to actually being able to get projects approved more quickly?
We are. So I think there's a lot of regulatory consensus around nature based solutions. So the US Army Corps of Engineers has a group called Engineering with Nature. They've really touted that approach. It doesn't mean that it's always completely smooth, but I think most resource agencies are looking at impact, right? And if we can show them clearly, hey, here's our habitat to impact ratio, right? So we give them simple numbers, simple metrics, and say a seawall would be, a negative 3x habitat to impact ratio. You're impacting a lot of habitat, and you're not really providing any net benefit, right? In terms of surface area or voids or crevices that say coral can grow on. And what we're able to do is do the opposite. We're providing 5 times the habitat to the bottom that we're actually covering up. And so providing some of those simple metrics really helps to make the resource agencies makes their decisions easier because they can understand and weigh the costs and benefits of these type techniques.
And
Is that
regulatory infrastructure, it takes a long time to set up. It requires a lot of complex thinking, sophisticated thinking, and sometimes it can take a long time as a result to change. And there's also care, right? Like people are exercising, they're being prudent and careful. So sometimes that can take a
that's right?
while to shift. So we've largely been talking about public entities. There are also private entities who have huge water demands and are engaged on the water side. Are you seeing private sector players adopt this?
Yeah, absolutely. So about a third of our business is private commercial. About a third is, say, public sector of all flavors. So federal, state, local, municipal, et cetera. And then a third is kind of everything else. So that's individual property owners, homeowners, conservation organizations, just a mix of all kinds of different unique opportunities. So it's kind of a third, a third, a third. And I'd say that we see, fairly consistent adoption across industry verticals. It's not like there's any one that it doesn't only work for government or only work for private industry. I guess one way to look at it is the water doesn't really care who owns the land, right? It's going to work in the same way. And so that's really what we focus on is how do we solve the problem for the client in the most efficient, economic, and the most straightforward way possible, right? So how do we bring a new tool to the table, solve their problem, and kind of allow them to shift into a kind of a new way of thinking with adaptive management and designing nature into how they build versus trying to exclude it, which is the kind of the old mindset that I think we've all had.
So you're talking about very different kind of clients. So that must mean that the dollar size also varies. Are you able to kind of go up and down that range because of the modular approach you're taking?
That's right. Yeah. So a small homeowner might be 30 modules and some clients are 3,000, right? Modules. So for something big, it's just more, it's like Legos, right? So if you need something bigger or longer or, larger structure, you just more Legos to solve that problem.
That's fascinating. And how does it affect temperature? How does temperature affect, right? So we're talking about things like coral reefs. I can think of, in the US, I could think about the southern shoreline, but we also have some Great Lakes and, other places that have very different kind of temperatures. How do these nature-based solutions work in different contexts?
I think the answer in our world is always it depends. And that's a good and a bad thing. So we have done a project in the Great Lakes. It was kind of a habitat based project for an endangered species that's doing really well. So that's had so far great results. And I think we've kind of sell, I guess our business is based in the Southeast. We do a lot of work in the US Southeast, but really do stuff all over the country. So I think we're in 12 US states, maybe 13 now. And so I wouldn't say that there's really any gotchas with temperature or location. And I think that's the advantage of, but I didn't haven't even shared yet that we have an advanced manufacturing process, right? So we make these modular nature based exoforms, we call them, and we make them through our own patented advanced manufacturing process. And it was designed specifically so that we can design with nature. So we have the ability to make modules that have lots of holes and voids and structure and things that resemble a natural. If you look at anything natural, whether in the Amazon rainforest or a coral reef, it's going to have a lot of complexity, a lot of surface area, a lot of roughness, and we can uniquely make shapes that use those kind of naturalistic features to solve functional problems. And so the advantage of having that is we can kind of tailor the size, weight, structure, flow pattern to whatever the situation is. If we need a 3,000-pound block, we do that. If we need something that's 500 pounds, we do that. If we want water to flow left, we can engineer that in. We want it to flow through, we can engineer that in. So that allows us to solve all kinds of different problems in different areas of the country, different contexts.
Wow. So I didn't realize it was that customizable. So you're actually you can engineer blocks per site in a very different way.
We can. We've kind of learned that it's also smart to have some level of standardization, right? So, we want to solve problems that are consistent that we see in multiple areas. And, as we're solving the problem in site, we also have to think about handling and packing and moving. So you can make the best module in the world, but if you can't transport it, install it safely and efficiently, that's part of the equation as well. So we look to balance all those factors. And oftentimes we can take a standard shape, and if there's a unique requirement, we can do a couple modifications to it. That's something we can do with the click of a button, send that to the printer, print that out. And if that works, that might be a new kind of standard module for us.
Right, right. So you have kind of an open innovation process internally and how these things
That's
are
right.
evolving. Where's the technology going? So 5 years from now, is it going to look similar, or are we going to is it this accumulation of knowledge from applying this in many different contexts is going to start giving us different insights about how to build these kind of standard modules? Where do you see it going?
I think what we'll see and what we have been seeing in our business is a real convergence of the digital and the physical. We started out selling modules, and like I mentioned, our clients said, "Hey, we need some software. Tell us where should we focus on, and how do I pinpoint where I've got risk?" And so you start with that, and then we've taken that tool set and we've added on additional features to help look at the biological response. How are you helping endangered species? What's the biodiversity benefit of what you're doing? And then, with today's AI tools, we're finding ways to share that back with the community, share that back with the client, and to get better and better about how we build and how do we share the story. I think over time, I think what we'll see is more and more of a platform type approach. So we've done a lot of projects, right? 115,000 units out there. But as we start tying some of these results together at scale and pulling that back into our platform that's informed and enriched with AI, we can get a lot smarter about how do we scale this up? How do we understand the biological response? How do we support the species and the functional goals that we're trying to accomplish with these modular techniques?
And what do you think is the biggest thing that's going to help unlock the uptake of this? So education, awareness, absolutely, it's always critical. Is it a financing mechanism? Is it something else, or is it just as it starts to become more pervasive?
Yeah, no, I really think it's a combination of people having the willingness to try new things, right? That's a cultural tendency that we often coach our clients on, is that it's always easier to do things the old way. If you've got economic benefit, functional benefit, environmental benefit, and aesthetic benefit, that's not really the issue. It's really just people being willing to try something or consider something new. In order to help facilitate that, I think one thing that we've learned, and I think our entire industry is learning, is that we have to simplify these solutions down, simplify the language, show our clients the math, show them the numbers, show them the economic benefits, so that it's a little bit easier to try those new things, a little bit easier to justify it. I do think that some of us, we get so passionate, and I'm guilty of this myself, probably even in this conversation. You get so excited about, say, the biodiversity benefits or all the environmental elements of what you're doing and all the technology, that you can talk over your clients. You can talk past them, right? And it's really important for us all to have that kind of a simple, straightforward value proposition as people are making decisions whether to build traditional hardened infrastructure or go with living infrastructure. You need to boil it down, make it simple, not talk over them.
Leonard, I realized even in our earlier conversation, I don't think I mentioned this. As a kid, one summer, we moved 15 ton of stone down to shoreline to create a hardened seawall to protect that shoreline.
Yep.
It was down a long hill, and I have to say that was not easier.
Mm.
We would have loved to have had a nature-based solution that was still in place, because that needed to be replaced.
That's right.
So viscerally picture it and see the benefits that this starts to create.
Yeah. And another interesting thing, and this is where the software comes in, wouldn't you have liked to know if you could have gotten by with 6 tons instead of 15 tons, right? You got
Yeah.
15 tons, but did you really need 15 tons? And wouldn't it be great to have a digital model of that creek bed or that bank, and to know, hey, we don't need 15 tons. We can save that money. We can save all that backbreaking labor and just put the 6 tons in this way, and then plant these types of plants to support it, and we're done, right? So
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
the first tool that I would encourage people to use is just their eyes. So if you, no matter where you live, no matter where you are, if you see a lot of, say, impervious surfaces or say turf grass, right? There are simple ways to slow water down and make your life easier. So if you've got runoff issues in your own yard or at a local community park, and it rains and you get that really muddy water that goes into the creeks and rivers, all you really have to do is maybe plant, say, more biodiverse seed mix, right? Instead of turf grass in a few areas, or put little rain garden, which is just a little shallow depression and some wood chips. So there's simple, low cost, really easy ways to get started. We are building a lot of different tools and kits that have a kind of a lower price point, lower entry point for that purpose, because I think nature-based solutions are not just for the coast. They're not just for deep water, ocean-based coral restoration. This could be in your backyard. There's a really neat YouTube series called National Park at Home. The professor who, spent his career looking at how can someone in their very own yard do small things that can, say, bring in pollinators or birds. As you start to do that, you can find ways to solve problems functionally as you're making your yard more attractive and more resilient, and you're taking pressure off of all the environmental systems downstream of your yard, right? Public works type projects, when those open up for community comments, just incremental adaptive management, it can bring people a lot of joy and a lot of beauty, make your property more valuable. So that's what I usually encourage people to do.
You point out another important theme, which is that water flows. So we're connected, right? What happens upstream affects all those downstream. I'm talking to you now from Washington, D.C. area, and we have rivers and the Chesapeake Bay, which is an incredible resource, but it also is directly impacted by all of those kind of behaviors that people do in their own homes all the way through that watershed. And it's one of those places where we recognize how much, as a large community, really impact one another.
When you think about the water, let's say in Virginia, right? In a lake, supposedly you own a certain amount towards the center point of the lake. And then in Virginia, you own, quote unquote, own the water up to mean low water. But the reality is that everybody owns it. It's everybody's water, right? And it's not any one person's responsibility. So if we can all take small incremental efforts and steps to improve how we interact with the water, how we interact with natural species and the natural world, that provides an uplift for all of society, right? And I was looking at a economic report on North Carolina, and there's $200 billion of coastal assets in the state of North Carolina, right? So enormous tax base, enormous economic base. And the things that happen upstream of the coast, right? What we do in Raleigh or Fayetteville or New Bern, that's going to flow down and impact what's happening at the beach where we go to vacation and where we like to fish and swim. I think it's really important that we think through the economic opportunities for enhancing and restoring natural systems. And in my opinion, I think that these should be not just by the public sector, but by the private sector as well. These are sensible investments that create economic value, creates assets. Just like you said at the beginning of our talk here, if you build a seawall or a road, you've kind of got yourself a liability. But if you deploy a nature-based solution, you have an asset that creates value over time.
Leonard, that's a perfect last line to leave us on. I really appreciate that you're taking the time to speak today and share this information. I think people are going to find it really informative. Thanks for taking the time with us.
Appreciate it, Stuart. Thank you.
So at a time when we need more of these kind of solutions, we have a solution that can really play a key role, and we have an innovation that can play a key role in kind of providing solutions. We're going to need to ramp up an entirely new production system to create these new nature-based solutions. Companies like Natrx are really taking a step forward in doing that. Fascinatingly, they've created a modular-based approach. They can semi-customize their approach to many different contexts, but they find where there's commonalities, they can standardize it and create modules that can scale from the individual homeowner's size solution all the way up to the port level, large commercial port level solution. And these are applicable in anywhere we have interactions with seas, lakes, and rivers. So it's a massive part of our society and our productive capacity that really requires these kinds of things. Leonard and his organization are kind of front runners in a really big transformation that's occurring, which is going from kind of barriers and taming of the sea and water to instead looking to nature for inspiration on how we can live with water in far more productive ways. And there's a whole category of solutions that they're calling nature-based solutions, which do this effectively. And these nature-based solutions just to give you a sense, instead of creating a seawall that's a complete barrier between land and water, instead creates a permeable region so that water can, for example, pass through it, but still protect the land that's behind it. And that's right for a seawall. Similarly, there are times when we need to create barriers, not just right at the boundary between the land and the sea, but close to those barriers, right? So harbors need to be protected from very large waves. Historically, you take huge amounts of stone or concrete or other really hard materials and put it outside of a harbor in what we call a breakwater. And the waves will break on those stones, and therefore it'll be peaceful inside the harbor. So let's do a side-by-side comparison for a second. You take big stones, hard material, you put it outside of a harbor to create a breakwater. Or you do the same thing with a nature-based solution. In the traditional approach, it can be really effective. The waves break on that seawall. It can help protect the harbor and create a much calmer space inside the harbor. Nature-based solution, you install the nature-based solution, which looks similar to the stones, but it's designed differently. You put it outside the harbor. It also will protect the harbor and create a safe space within the harbor. But with the breakwater using hard stones, doesn't allow water to permeate, doesn't allow water to go in and out. That means that water carries nutrients. It enables plant life to grow, enables animal life to grow. All of that is impeded by using a traditional breakwater. Whereas if you use a nature-based solution, water can permeate. It slows down the water, but water is actually able to permeate the barrier. So you get nutrient exchanges from inside the harbor to outside the harbor. You get plant life growing. You have kind of vibrant animal life, fish stocks, others that actually can live inside and outside the harbors if you use a nature-based solution. There are other advantages, which I think is really interesting, come to light in this episode. Because the traditional approach is blocking out the sea, it requires so much more mass and strength. So you have to move that many more materials often from very far away. You move them. It doesn't have nearly as much force applied to it. So the amount of materials you have to apply is much less. The amount of damage you have to do while installing it in the seabed is much less. So it's a much lighter on the ecosystem. And incredibly, seawalls, the traditional approach, because they are this hard, non-living material, as soon as you put them in place, they're going to start degrading. You're going to need to start planning for the replacement. And it's a constant part of living with these kind of traditional approaches, which is getting even more exacerbated now. The climate is changing and we're getting more extreme weather. Nature-based solutions, because they work with the way that the sea and plant life and animal life work, plant life and animal life start to grow around these nature-based solutions, almost like a coral reef. And so those nature-based solutions get more effective with time, and they get more robust and more resilient with time. Instead of having a depreciating asset in the old system, we now start to have an appreciating asset. Like it's more effective, it's more valuable with time. So it's remarkable to see how many benefits this new transition to nature-based solutions really create. And one of the things we discussed in this conversation is that it's one of these rare occurrences where we don't have a series of trade-offs between an old model and a new model. Instead, the new model, the nature-based solutions, in many instances are really straightforwardly what are called a superior alternative. They're better on each of the dimensions that you think of in evaluating which one to go with. They're cheaper to make, they're cheaper to install, less impact on the environment that they come from, and they last longer and they become more valuable with time as opposed to depreciating. The other major change is we've changed the technology, we've changed the production system. We're going to need to change the decision-making system. Policymakers, procurement officers, people who are making decisions about what kinds of solutions to implement, they're the folks who really need to become acquainted with this, to learn about it, to get comfortable with it, to shift behavior in the aggregate level. And that's really kind of where the frontier is right now. And so conversations like today, we're helping to go through this in an accessible level, but also a level of kind of detail, and are really important because they help address the critical factor, which is we need to increase awareness of the potential and the productive nature of these kinds of solutions. I just would want to point out that Natrx and the organization that Leonard is leading, this is an example of a market-based company. It's a straightforward market-based company that is advancing resilient solutions to extreme weather and the changing climate. Some of that work was really enabled by a non-for-profit, a citizen sector organization that we talked to earlier in this process, RISE, who received funding from, in part, a federal response to Sandy that led to a state-based intention to create an innovation lab that is run by Rise, a nonprofit, and now here is contributing to the success of a for-profit company that is advancing nature-based solutions in a scalable way. And you can learn more about Rise in our episode where I interview Paul Robinson, the executive director. And so this is also just a wonderful example. I think it's really helpful for us to see of how federal policy difference can lead to state action, local citizen sector organizations, kind of creating a living laboratory that are kind of really advancing the work of for-profit companies that will scale these solutions to the magnitude of the problem. I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.